Hello everyone, welcome to the Take Care Man channel. My name is Todd and my goal on this channel is to equip men to take better care of themselves. I'm doing a viewer request video today. The request came back in July. This is November, so it's taken me a little while to get to it, but I told you this would be the next video topic that I posted, and so here it is. And let me just show you the topic of this video by showing you the actual request that came from a viewer. I'm finding myself more and more angry with the state of the world. I know I'm not the only one. I'm so mad, sometimes I just want to move into a cave. Maybe you could bring up ways to deal with stress like this on your channel. And I'm definitely going to do that. This is not going to be a political video at all. This is going to be a video where I talk about something called headline stress, the effect of news on our mental health. And just to let you know a little bit of a background that I bring to this, I'm a professor. I teach social work. I was a psychotherapist and also the director of a community mental health center. And so I have experience with mental health and counseling. And part of my personal mission is to help men cope with issues in their lives. So really a focus on men's mental health. So this whole issue of being disturbed by the news or disturbed by things going on, as we know, that's appropriate for a variety of reasons, and we'll get into that. But it can start to affect our mental health. And so we're going to look at ways at how we can stay informed without being overwhelmed. There's been a lot of writing lately about headline stress disorder, which is actually a phrase that was coined by Dr. Stephen Stonesy, who is a psychologist. And his basic definition for headline stress disorder was that it's a high emotional response to endless reports from the news media, such as feeling anxiety and stress. So let me just give you a little outline of what I'm going to talk about in this video. I'm going to affirm that it's good to be informed about what's going on in the world, but there's going to be some caveats to that. There are some things which we should be concerned about. There's things that are going on that, we need to be aware of and that we, in fact, should be taking action on. We're also going to talk about what too much news can do to us, how it can affect our mental health and our physical health and our overall relationships and just our life. We're going to talk about how to stay informed in a more mindful and critical way. Then we're going to talk about focusing on things that are most important to your personal goals and how to change the things that you can actually control. So let's talk about the importance of staying informed. Particularly in the United States and democracies, it's important to be engaged as a citizen, as a voter, as someone who is active in your community, as just a citizen. It's important to stay informed. And of course, a lot of us just like to be in the know about what's going on. It helps when we're having conversations with others. So sometimes we just don't want to miss out. And we'll be talking more about that in a little while. But also, consuming news gives us a broader perspective and different experiences from a variety of people in different parts of the world and different parts of the country and people that may have different views than we do. It also helps develop within us empathy for those that are going through difficult times, seeing what individuals are experiencing. As I tell my students, it's one thing to hear about something or, to see some statistics on it. It's another thing to see the faces and the emotions that people are going through as they're experiencing something. And then many of us just see ourselves as lifelong learners and want to learn as much as we can. And so staying up with current events in the news is part of how we see one of the goals of our life. So there are some things that should trouble us, that we should be notified about, that we should be aware of. We're going to talk about the timing of when you should be notified of things. There's some things you should be notified of immediately. So for example, if there's a tornado warning that's bearing down on your county, you need to know that right then so you can seek shelter for yourself and your family. Other threats to public health apply there too, whether it be a chemical spill or like the pandemic we're currently going through. And some of those things you have to be informed of maybe more immediately, and others, maybe not so much immediately. We should be concerned about violence. We should be concerned about destruction of property. We should be concerned about the suffering of others. We should be concerned about economic instability because that affects people's lives and it affects their well-being and their quality of life. And we should be concerned about threats to the rule of law, situations where the normal rules, laws, and regulations that govern our life seem to be thrown out and there seems to be chaos or anarchy. Let's talk about what too much information does to us. Our brain can experience vicarious or secondary trauma and can lead to PTSD, meaning when we're watching people suffer, like when people are going through a traumatic event, We sort of experience that trauma in a strange kind of way, almost like they are, particularly if we expose ourselves to a lot of coverage about that event. That starts to seep into us, and it can almost feel like we're there and that we're going through the trauma. Now, granted, it's nothing like actually being there and experiencing it, and particularly if that person's a victim of violence or something like that. But still, it can be traumatic to us. We call that vicarious trauma or secondary trauma, and it has been shown to lead to symptoms of PTSD, post-traumatic stress disorder. And as you'll see from some of the research articles I'll show you in just a little bit, you actually can develop PTSD just from watching the news. Some of those symptoms of that stress from getting too much information are anxiety, depression, trouble sleeping, hypertension, and then other physical symptoms. And it's kind of a vicious cycle. The more you watch, the more you worry, and then the more you watch. The research bears that out. And we tend to lose perspective on the issue being covered and often ignore what is important to us. So the way the news may be covering it may make us miss the big picture, and we may be looking more at the sensational aspects of it. But also it can kind of disconnect us, detach us, disassociate us from our lives. We sort of check out of our own lives and sort of check into what's going on in the news. And doing this can seem like pseudo-importance because we're watching important information, watching important news unfold, but we may be letting the important things in our lives, go unattended to. So it may be a form of avoidance for some people. Sometimes that's not even consciously. So just like I was talking about with the PTSD type symptoms, we tend to internalize the crises that we watch unfold on TV. The news can make us feel like we are in constant crisis because there's this constant 24/7 news cycle with notifications blowing up our phone and us being aware of when bad things are happening all over the world almost immediately after they happen. And research has shown that our mind tends to be drawn to the negative news. We tend to be pulled in by it, where we may not pay as much attention to more positive news or news that's not that sensational. The big stories, the negative news where there is human suffering, where there is destruction of property, those are the stories that tend to draw us in. By the way, for each of these articles that I mention or show you, I will have links to the article in the description. It may take me a couple of days to get it up there, but I'll basically have resources by slide number. This particular study looked at media exposure to mass violence events and how they can fuel a cycle of distress. And they found that when people watched events that were violent, such as the Boston Marathon bombings or the Pulse nightclub shooting, that people would watch it, which in turn would get them more and more concerned, which they would watch more, which caused them to be more distressed. And so there tends to be a cycle to the way we get pulled into negative news events. This article looked at a similar phenomenon, but particularly looked at social media and how it affects us being triggered by the news. But it, I think, poses this sort of dilemma that we face as people who want to stay informed as citizens is, do you want to be a well-informed citizen or do you want to be sane? Because it definitely can affect your health and make you have a lower quality of life. And this one, you can just look at the title here, but Online Social Media Fatigue and Psychological Well-Being, a study of compulsive use, fear of missing out, fatigue, anxiety, and depression. And they look specifically here at the effects of the use of social media and how we can suffer from social media fatigue and how it affects our mental health and our physical health. It's important to note that the news can become addictive to us. It can be like a drug. And that's just like our devices can become addictive. Social media news has become drug-like to us. And one of the things you have to ask yourself, are you using news to medicate boredom or to avoid something else, like I was talking about earlier? And if we are addicted to news and we tend to wean ourselves off of it and not be on it as much, we need to have other healthy habits or other activities to take place of what we were using news for. As a consumer of news, it's important for you to remember that news outlets are businesses. Now, granted, journalists and people that own those businesses, I'm sure they take very seriously the mission of keeping citizens informed. That's part of the reason they went into it, I'm sure, is that they felt like they were helping people by reporting on stories. And that's true, but ultimately they are businesses. In order to put out their stories, they have to collect revenue. They have to sell ads. They know that watching more news leads to you watching even more news. And their ultimate goal, if you think about it from a business model, is to keep you watching. That affects ratings, that affects clicks, whether, if it's an internet source of news. They sell advertising based on the ratings of how many people watch a particular program or watch a particular channel or listen to a particular podcast. And they also want to be the first to break a particular news story, because being first, you get a reputation of that, advertisers take note, and it increases your value as a business. News outlets know that the best way to keep you watching their program or their channel or their content is to affect you emotionally, to get an emotional reaction from you. So you being stressed by the news is actually good for their business model. Now, I would like to think that news executives and newsroom editors are not sitting around saying, how can we stress people out? I hope those conversations are not that blatant and intentional, but if that's what they're trying to do, maybe they should be. And many of people have written about the culture of fear, how we've developed this fear that, we're constantly trying to do something to feel safer, whether it is to buy products that make us feel safer or to avoid doing things that may make us feel unsafe, that we've sort of developed this whole culture of fear. For advertisers, the most powerful emotion they can tap into is fear. And watching the news can also make us feel excited or aroused or stimulated. It can actually cause the secretion of certain hormones and neurotransmitters that actually sort of, amp up our system. But it can also give us a sense of being falsely connected, sort of a pseudo engagement, like we're really involved, when in fact we may just be sitting there passively listening to the news. This fear of missing out is something that's been written about, talked about a lot. This idea that all of us sort of have this fear of missing out on key information or not being in the know, being the last to know, just missing out on what's going on. Many of you probably know about Pavlov's dogs. He's the experimenter who had dogs who would listen to a bell ring and food would be produced and they would salivate when the food arrived. And after a while, he could just remove the food and just the sound of the bell caused the dogs to start salivating. Well, the same is sort of true for alerts on our phones, those dings and pings and bells and whistles and flashing lights that tell us to pick up our phone because something important is happening. The research has shown we actually get little hits of dopamine when we get those alerts. And sometimes, whether consciously or subconsciously, we become scared of what will happen if we don't watch the news. It almost becomes a compulsion. And many news outlets have developed an overt partisan bias so that make you feel like you belong there, like this is where you need to hang out. This is your tribe. And that may be true to some extent, but overly partisan news is not really that informative often. So let's talk a little bit about how to stay informed in a more mindful way. So consider getting your news via radio or by reading actual text. It's electronic text even. But, newspapers, not many people read paper newspapers anymore. Not many people listen to the actual radio that much anymore. But you may listen to news podcasts or news updates that come out. Like for myself, I listen to the hourly news update from NPR. I don't listen to it every hour, but I might listen to it once in the morning, once in the evening, something like that. But watching TV news is really triggering because you're seeing all those images, and it's really easy to sort of sit mindlessly in front of that TV. And when I say TV, I also mean like online video. And social media can almost be the worst source of news because sometimes it's reduced down to a meme or some little photo, oftentimes which are not true. And I just told you I kind of check the news a couple times a day. Maybe consider doing that once a day. If you have notifications turned on that tell you that there is a tornado on top of you, well, then you'll know that when it happens. But maybe you don't need to know what's happening in the rest of the world or even in the rest of the country until, say, once a day. Try to monitor your reaction. See what the news is doing to you, how it's affecting you physically, emotionally, and cognitively. And if you feel the coverage is getting to you, if you feel yourself starting to get distressed by the news, realize that you can miss out on it a couple of days and it's not really going to change the situation. It's probably not going to change how it affects you, but it will change how much of an effect it's having on your mental health in the short run. So consider unplugging, fasting from news for a couple of days if you need to. I know I do that frequently. When I just get overwhelmed by what's going on, I'll unplug a little bit. Now, that's not avoiding things. That's not really trying to disassociate. It's just to say, okay, if I'm going to stay engaged and be someone who's trying to be of benefit to my community, I need to be able to keep my head above water and be well physically and mentally. And I can just feel myself getting overwhelmed here and I need to disconnect for a couple of days. So as I hinted at earlier, consider turning off any unnecessary notifications on your devices. I remember when I first signed up for breaking news alerts from CNN, And my phone went off one day and it was a breaking news item. And I was like, oh, let me see what's happening in the world. And it was announcing the winner of the Nathan's hot dog eating contest. That's not breaking news. That's broke news. Really? Hot dog eating contest? Breaking news, CNN? Come on. So think about, what do you really need to know immediately? What do you really need to know about on your phone? Consider turning off those notifications, or find a way to limit them, or only check them a couple times a day. But find a way to make sure things get through that need to get through. If you're not sure how to do that, ask a friend, ask a family member who's really skilled at doing the fine adjustments to your notifications. You don't want to suffer from filter failure. You want to make sure you have the right filters in place to let information through when you need it, and then maybe hold back information that you can consume at a later time. Consider setting a timer, whether it be on your consumption of news or your consumption of social media. You say, I'm going to allow myself 15 minutes to scroll through my social media feeds, or I'm going to allow myself, to watch this one 30-minute news program today, and that's it. And then, and this one's not easy to do, but try to accurately analyze the news. You want to be an informed consumer of the news. You want to be a mindful consumer of the news. I've been thinking lately, as someone who teaches social welfare policy, who looks at problems that are going on in society and thinking about how we respond to them. And I thought to myself, we tend to look too narrowly at incidents and act like they're more widely occurring than we might think that they are. Although sometimes we do underestimate some things, but generally I think we tend to look narrowly at what's happening and think, okay, this little slice of what's going on here, this is a representation of everything that's going on in this realm. And then we tend to act too broadly. Rather than using a scalpel to make adjustments and to try to address the issue, we tend to pull out a big hammer and just swing wildly and try to make big sweeping changes without fully assessing what's going on. Instead, we should be looking broader at the overall scope of experience around an issue, and then acting more precisely and intentionally and deliberately, rather than just trying to have a knee-jerk reaction to one incident. Our brains love simplicity, not complexity. However, the truth's complex. There are multiple reasons for a variety of different social problems. There's not one reason for one issue. They tend to be pretty complicated. They're kind of a house of cards, if you will. It's a complex, interdependent web of issues that affect other issues. Remember, the news outlets don't need you to think, they need you to feel, but you need to be thinking. You need to be an informed and aware and mindful consumer of the news. Our brains tend to look for patterns in the news, particularly those that fit the narratives that we tend to believe. So if we tend to have a particular political ideology, we tend to look for patterns within the news that fit within that predetermined ideology that we have. Social media algorithms tend to give you just more of what you like. There's a recent Netflix documentary called The Social Dilemma, which looks at this effect of social media on us, and particularly how social media is collecting information on us and how it's geared to make us stay engaged by showing us things we tend to engage with and hiding things we tend not to engage with. So social media algorithms just give you more of what you like. Try to know the bias of the news outlet that you're using. I realize that that is a controversial subject. I'm going to show you some resources that might help you with that in a little bit. But we always want to look and see how balanced maybe the coverage is on a given issue. I would suggest using some of the nonpartisan fact-checking sites. Now, you'll hear some people say, well, they say they're nonpartisan, but they're really funded by X, Y, and Z. And that's why I try to use the fact-checking resources that actually disclose their funding. So, for example, factcheck.org, they give you complete description of what their funding sources are. Same thing for PolitiFact. They do the same thing. They're nonpartisan and give you their complete funding details. Now, I want to share a lot of information from different articles out there, but I'm going to focus a lot on the Pew Research Center. They put out a lot of great research related to media and politics in the U.S. And in a recent report, they really point out the fact that in 2020, we are more polarized in terms of our consumption of media than ever before. And that depending on our party leanings, we may distrust more sources than others, or we may just be distrustful in general about news. It's no secret to you that if you flip between certain channels, particularly those with more of a partisan bent, you may see a completely different approach to covering the same type of story. Now, there's one website that I'll link below. And by the way, this is slide number 27 I'm on currently, so you can look at the links once I get those posted in the description. This comes from Vanessa Otero and her website. It's Adfontes Media. I guess that's correct, or Adfontes Media. And you can see here this chart that they do of basically from more liberal news sources to more conservative news sources. And I've checked out their analysis and their resources, and they appear to be pretty nonpartisan and pretty fair. And you can see at the top, they have like liberal, and they even say it's like utter garbage or conspiracy theories, all the way to conservative, utter garbage conspiracy theories. And then you have hyper-partisan liberal, hyper-partisan conservative, skews conservative, skews liberal, meaning they lean a little bit, but they tend to be sort of trustworthy in some ways. And then you have mainstream sort of minimal partisan bias. Here's another way that they've done that. They've plotted this out based on stories, and you can see that they're, ranking this from the extent to which they're reporting facts all the way to, complex analysis or mixed fact reporting and analysis, analysis or high variation in reliability, opinion or high variation in reliability, and then selective or incomplete news stories. And so they've basically mapped out here how each news outlet tends to cover the news. And so they have here within these little triangles, the ones that are dotted, they have the most reliable news sources, some that are reliable for news, but high in analysis, opinion content. Then some that have some reliability issues and may be extreme at time. Then there are those that have serious reliability problems and have a lot of extremism expressed on their news outlet. And again, these are slides 27 and 28, so if you want to look deeper, you can. They also analyze individual news programs. So they don't just look at a news network, say CNN, MSNBC, Fox, but they look at specific programs on that network and look at the amount of bias, whether it be liberal or conservative, and how reliable they tend to be. Quite often, the people that you hear complaining most about mainstream media and media bias are conservatives. And for that reason, I thought I would show you here on slide 30, there's some pretty good articles out there about what are the most credible conservative news sources. So if you're conservative and you want to feel comfortable that the news media that you are consuming is accurate, resources like this can help you. Likewise, if you tend to be more liberal and maybe you want to see the more reliable liberal sources, you can look for the same type of information. Slide 31 here, another news media site, media bias fact check site. They tend to categorize different news sources all the way from left to right. They have those that are the least biased. That's a category. But then they have those that are conspiracy or pseudoscience, those that have questionable sources, those that are pro-science, and then those that are satirical, that are like funny sites like The Onion. This is another website I would recommend to you called All Sides, where they really try to give balance coverage to the news. That's slide 32 if you want to check out the link in the description. There's also news sources like the Good News Network, where they focus primarily on good news. They focus on stories where the best of humanity sort of comes for the forefront when the better angels of our nature, do things that are newsworthy. Consider increasing your news literacy. The two-party political system in the U.S. creates a false dichotomy that you're either a Republican or Democrat, or you're liberal or conservative, and that you can reduce all political views into these two little neat boxes. And partisan news tends to enforce that illusion. It makes us think that, okay, well, here's this news program for this way of thinking, and here's this news program for this way of thinking. And when we start to lose the more non-biased, non-partisan, more factual and less opinion news sources, then that sort of reinforces that whole partisan divide. I'm actually going to show you from the Pew's research that we are allowing the furthest ends of the political spectrum to pull us apart, and the news coverage tends to be making us think we're more divided than maybe we actually are, but also that the people on the far right or far left tend to characterize people that tend to be left-leaning and right-leaning. We need to really fight against that us versus them mentality. The biggest thing that voters are currently concerned about, and the research bears this out, is not even the coronavirus. That's like their second biggest concern right now. But the biggest one is that we are divided as a nation. This is slide 35. If you want to look at the description, this is the political topology quiz, or typology, depending on how you like to pronounce it. But this looks at where you fit on the continuum of different political leanings or political ways of thinking. And they've reduced it at Pew by studying it, seeing where the clusters are. They've reduced it to the following categories. So you have core conservatives, country first conservatives, market skeptic Republicans, new era enterprisers, bystanders, devout and diverse, disaffected Democrats, opportunity Democrats, and solid liberals. Now, I won't define all those. You can look at the resources that are there to look more at those definitions, and you can take the test yourself to see where you fall out on this. But I want you to notice that if we look at core conservatives and solid liberals, they're a really small percentage of the general public. So you look that only 13% of the general public are core conservatives, only 16% are solid liberals. But notice if you move to register voters and then all the way to politically engaged, a larger percentage of the politically engaged are core conservatives and are solid liberals. So even though they're a smaller segment of society, they tend to be more politically engaged. And you can see that even with the 20 and 25% at both ends, the majority of Americans are in between those two ends of the continuum. And that's not to say that core conservatives and solid liberals are extreme. There's actually, you could go past that, I would say, to more extreme views even beyond that. And that's even a smaller segment of society, but those small segments tend to be the ones that get the coverage. Here's another way to look at it sort of in a horizontal fashion, this distribution from solid liberals to core conservatives. And you see here a comparison of Democrats and Republicans and the percentage of those that tend to be politically engaged. You can see here on a divisive issue like abortion, those that say it should be illegal in most or all cases, and those that say it should be legal in most or all cases. And you see the divide here on these, the breakdowns, based on which of these particular political topologies they fall in. So which particular group do you fall in? That sort of falls out here on this particular graph in terms of how it might predict your views on abortion. So notice with core conservatives and even country first conservatives, you get a predicted divide there, much as you do with solid liberals. But you can see that the majority of Americans have more nuanced views of abortion and tend to have views that might not be fully captured in this type of illegal-legal dichotomy. The same thing with same-sex marriage, another divisive issue. You can see here that there is an extreme difference on the polar ends of the political continuum, but much more agreement in terms of diversity of opinion when you look at more moderate Americans. Here's another thing from Pew Research that shows generally what the problem is. Nearly half of Republicans and Democrats say too extreme describes either their own party, very or somewhat well, realizing that even with their own party, that the party has gone too far left if you're Democrats, or too far right if you're Republicans. So we're aware as Americans, even those of us that might lean one way or the other, that there's still forces within that left or right leaning that are pulling us too far right or left. So we really have to be careful and realize that the news media is kind of contributing to that. And realize that when they show extreme views, which are much more likely to elicit emotional response from viewers, and therefore people are going to watch it more, they're going to show you the people on the far left, the people on the far right, and that's going to affect how you view people who lean right or lean left, when the reality is that the majority of people are not on those extreme ends. Try to look for non-radical voices on two sides of an issue. Pay less attention to the radical ones. And as I just said, news media love covering the ones that are extreme because they elicit emotion. Try to reward outlets, like with your views, your clicks, maybe even your subscription, that focus on sensible, moderate, and balanced views. I'm going to recommend a couple of YouTube series from the Crash Course channel. The Crash Course Navigating Digital Information and Crash Course Media Literacy are two great sources of learning how to consume news media. I'll link those below. This is slide 43. I'll link some of my favorite episodes from those two series. These kind of resources help you recognize and avoid cognitive distortions that may happen where you tend to misinterpret the news based on some sort of fallacy of thinking. This will overall just help you be a more critical and accurate consumer of news. Overall, it just helps you keep things in perspective and as factual as possible. Try to keep a local and personal focus. Be a positive influence in your community. Focus on your personal health and the well-being of your family and friends. Engage with your faith community or other institution. And keep in mind the Serenity Prayer. There's things that you can control. There's things you can't control. Focus on those things that you can control. So try to exercise courage and change the things you can, and try to be serene and understanding there's certain things that you can't control. This is pretty simple advice, but it bears repeating. Get outside, exercise, take a walk, breathe some fresh air, do something you enjoy, call up some friends or family, pray. Pray for wisdom to understand what you can change and what you can't change. Accept that there's certain things that happen in society that can't be predicted, that can't be prevented. Try to avoid the doomsday prophets out there. Believe in the resiliency of people and nations. A lot of students I'm teaching right now are a little concerned about this election in terms of what if it takes a while for us to know who the ultimate winner is. And I tell them about 2000, which is not that long ago, and probably most of my viewers can remember that, the Gore and Bush election, and how we basically waited almost a month before we were sure who won that election. And the U.S. handled that fine. Al Gore conceded, and we moved on, had a peaceful transition of power in our country. This is a resilient nation, speaking of the U.S., and we need to have some faith in that the American people tend to pull together and do what's right. Understand the fight, flight, or freeze response. That's this idea that when we are stressed or triggered or feel anxious, we may tend to want to engage and fight what's going on. We may completely run away and hide from it, or we just freeze. We don't know what to do about what's going on. We want to tap into a more rational, reasoned response and try to be a positive effect in our community, maybe even addressing the issue that we're concerned about from the news, but in no way trying to increase division, instead trying to be a force for healing. Ultimately, really focus on being civil, respectful, and kind. Our experiences are valid, but they're different than other people's experiences. Keep in mind the experience that you have and how strongly you feel about it is the same that other people may feel in terms of the actual magnitude of how strongly they feel that way. Try to discuss right and wrong policies and not good and evil people. One of the things that grieves me about our nation is that we've tended to move away from just you're incorrect or you're correct about your particular view, like your policy views on that are factually correct or not factually correct, or it won't turn out that way or it will turn out that way, to you're an evil person. That's not a helpful approach to political discourse where we label each other's character as good and evil. But you hear politicians even saying this, even calling other people evil. That's just not helpful to our political discourse. Try to believe the best of others. Most people want to raise their families, provide for them. They care about the health and welfare of their community. We have so many common goals, and we have to tap into those. And think about the things you might say online to people on social media. Would you go knock on their door at home and say that to them face to face, or just say it to them in person and, out in public? Think about what you would do face to face and try to let your social media activity match what you might do face to face. Unless you're a jerk face to people. Also, don't be a jerk on social media or in general. And I'm a good person. Evidence of this idea of viewing people who don't think like we do as evil, or as the Pew Research Center here termed it, immoral or closed-minded. You can see here the percentage of people from the Republican and Democratic parties who believe that people from the other party are either closed-minded, immoral, lazy, or unintelligent. And you can see that that belief in those four qualities of the other party have increased significantly just in the 3 years from 2016 to 2019. I can tell you this, I'm convinced that on both sides of most issues, not all issues, but on both sides of most issues, particularly when we're talking about traditional Democratic, traditional Republican viewpoints, there tend to be open-minded, moral, hardworking, and intelligent people on both sides. And something I like to stress, try to call out people in your own circles of influence that act in ways that are not civil or respectful. There's going to be no shortage of people on the other side of an issue that call out people. For example, there might be Democrats who call out Republicans for doing something that's uncivil or disrespectful. But what's really powerful if Republicans call out Republicans for that, or if Democrats call out Democrats for that, or if you call out somebody in your family or a friend group for that, rather than somebody that doesn't know them. In other words, it tends to be most powerful when it's coming from like-minded individuals. Try to avoid voices that promote division. Avoid those that seem to be seeking to sow the seeds of discord. Try to reject violent talk. Stay away from any kind of talk that tends to have, visualization of being violent towards others. Support those voices that tend to seek to unite and heal us. De-escalate, diffuse, slow down, breathe, act honorable, be a gentleman. It doesn't mean you have to agree with everybody. You can disagree in a very respectful way. There are greater strengths than the loudness of our voice or our physical power. So keep in mind that your civility, your kindness, your consideration is really powerful. Try to cultivate an abundance mentality and avoid a scarcity mentality, meaning that there are probably more resources out there than we realize. And if we think there's such a limited amount of resources that we have to grab for our own families or for people like us and try to keep it away from other people, that's more of a scarcity mentality. We want to realize that there's enough to share in the world. If we look at some of the major political issues in the U.S., like climate change, economic inequality, illegal immigration, so forth and so on, you can see here the percentage of Republicans in red and the percentage of Democrats in blue who tend to say that that issue is a very big problem in the country today. Again, this is from the Pew Research Center, and this is slide 51. You can see that on some issues there's great disagreement, like climate change and illegal immigration. So to Republicans, illegal immigration is a really big issue. To Democrats, climate change is a really big issue. But it's important to note there are Republicans there that say climate change is a big issue. Same thing for Democrats who say illegal immigration is a big issue. So to completely characterize 100% of Democrats or 100% Republicans thinking an issue is important or unimportant is just not accurate. And notice the ones where there's lots of agreement, like the affordability of a college education, or working to combat drug addiction, or making healthcare more affordable, or keeping down the federal budget deficit, or fighting terrorism. So there's more issues that we tend to agree on than we're different on. And we need politicians, news sources, voters who will reward those more moderate voices who tend to seek those things that there are agreement upon. Now, I realize I'm getting away a little bit from the whole idea of media consumption and mental health, but I think thinking about the issues in a way that's based in fact will help you to be a more mindful and therefore healthy consumer of news media. And then finally, be more proactive about your mental health. Monitor your stress. Talk about your stress. Discuss your symptoms with your doctor. If you feel like you may be becoming depressed or overly anxious, talk to your family doctor about that. Consider using the Employee Assistance Program through your work, where you might be able to see a counselor or see a psychiatrist. And if not through your EAP, you may actually have benefits through your regular health insurance. If you find yourself with thoughts of harming yourself or others, go to your local emergency room or call the National Suicide Hotline. Know the number in your area and keep it handy. The National Suicide Hotline number is 1-800-273-8255, 1-800-273-TALK. There was a piece of legislation passed this year that by 2022, there's going to be a national number like you have 911. There's going to be 988, which will link you to the National Suicide Hotline. I'm really excited about that law being passed, and I look forward to the time where that's fully enacted, and 988 is the number you can call for the suicide hotline. But for now, it's 1-800-273-8255. And I'll put a link in the description below for slide 52 for suicide hotline resources that are relevant to other countries. Again, this number is for the U.S. And in general, there's just more resources in the description. I hope this was helpful to you in some way. We're about to have the election here in the U.S. There's obviously going to be a lot of news in the next few days. I hope that in some way this helps you to cope with the headline stress. If you have questions or comments, please post them below. I would love for us to have a civil discourse about this issue. Thanks for watching, and as always, take care, man.